Sometimes the most broken souls find each other when they need it most. In 1887, that's exactly what happened in the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, when a traveling carnival set up their sideshow. Apache warriors stood in a line, available for hire at $1 each. Most people walked by without a second glance, but 7-year-old Keya approached with the fearless heart that only children possess. She pointed at the largest, most intimidating warrior in the lineup. "I'll take the giant one," she said simply. The towering man named Aianu had given up on kindness long ago. He'd forgotten what it felt like to be chosen for something good. This little girl was about to change his whole world. But how does a man who's lost everything learn to trust again? How does a child without a mother find her way home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge's main street, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and gold. This was a town caught between two worlds, the fading frontier and the encroaching march of what folks called civilization. Telegraph poles stood like sentinels alongside hitching posts, where horses still outnumbered the occasional motor wagon. The air carried the familiar sense of dust, leather, and the distant promise of rain that might never come. Old Pete McKinnon sat on his porch, whittling a piece of cedar while keeping one eye on the small figure playing in the yard. At 72, his hands still moved with the precision of a man who'd spent a lifetime crafting useful things from raw wood. But today, his fingers trembled slightly, not from age, but from the worn leather pouch he kept in his vest pocket. It had belonged to his adopted granddaughter's mother, and touching it reminded him daily of promises he'd made to a dying woman. Keya bounced a rubber ball against the side of the house with the endless energy that only a 7-year-old possessed. Her long black hair caught the sunlight as she moved, and her dark eyes sparkled with curiosity about everything around her. She was small for her age, but there was something fierce and determined in the way she carried herself, as if the world might try to knock her down, but it would have to catch her first. "Grandfather Pete," she called out, not missing a beat with her ball, "why do the grown-ups in town look at me funny sometimes?" Pete's knife paused mid-stroke. It was a question he'd been dreading, but also one he knew would come eventually. Keya was too smart and too observant to miss the way certain people stared, the way conversations stopped when she walked by, the way some mothers pulled their children a little closer when she passed. "Well, little one," he said carefully, "sometimes people don't understand things that are different from what they're used to, but that says more about them than it does about you." She caught the ball and turned to face him, her head tilted in that way she had when she was working through something complicated. "Is it because I look different from you?" Pete set down his whittling and patted his knee. Keya immediately abandoned her ball and climbed up into his lap, settling against his chest like she belonged there, which, as far as he was concerned, she absolutely did. "You know the story about how your mama and I met," he said, stroking her hair. "She was sick and scared, and you were just a tiny baby. She asked me to take care of you, and that was the easiest promise I ever made." "Because you loved her," Keya said matter-of-factly. "Because I loved her. And because the moment I saw you, I loved you too." Pete's voice grew soft. "Family isn't always about looking the same, sweetheart. It's about choosing to love each other. Every single day." The sound of carnival music drifted across the town, carried on the afternoon breeze. It had been playing for 3 days now, ever since the Morrison brothers' traveling spectacle had rolled into Cedar Ridge with their painted wagons and exotic promises. Pete had taken Keya to see the standard attractions, the strongman, the fortune-teller, the trained horses, but he'd steered clear of the more controversial displays. "Can we go see the carnival again today?" Keya asked, her eyes lighting up at the distant music. Pete hesitated. He'd heard talk in town about the latest addition to the show, and it made his stomach turn. But Keya was tugging at his sleeve with those pleading eyes that he'd never learned to resist. Down at the carnival grounds, the scene was exactly as Pete had feared. A crude wooden platform had been erected near the edge of the main tent, with a hand-painted sign that read, "Warriors of the Apache Nation. $1 for a day's labor or protection. See the savage nobility of the West." 7 Apache men stood on the platform, ranging in age from barely 20 to perhaps 50. They wore a mixture of traditional and white man's clothing, some in simple cotton shirts and trousers, others in partial traditional dress that had clearly been chosen more for show than authenticity. Their faces were carefully blank, but Pete could see the humiliation in their posture, the way they held themselves like men, trying to preserve some dignity in an impossible situation. Carnival barker Morrison himself stood beside the platform, his striped vest and waxed mustache making him look like something from a medicine show. He was in the middle of his pitch to a small crowd of curious onlookers, genuine Apache braves. Folks, each one a former warrior now available for honest work. Need your wood chopped? Your fence mended? Or perhaps you'd like the authentic protection of a real Indian scout for your next journey into the territories. $1 gets you a full day's service from any of these noble savages. Pete felt sick. He started to turn away, hoping to distract Keya with something else, but she had already slipped from his side and was walking straight toward the platform. Her small figure cut through the crowd like she owned the place, and Pete hurried after her, his heart pounding. The largest man on the platform stood at the far end of the line. He was easily 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders that strained against his cotton shirt and arms that spoke of a lifetime of physical labor. His black hair hung loose to his shoulders, and his weathered face might have been carved from stone. But it was his eyes that caught Pete's attention, dark and distant, like a man who had seen too much and expected nothing good from the world anymore. This was Aianu, though Pete didn't know his name yet. At 35, Aianu had been a war. Chief of the Chiricahua Apache, a man who had led his people through some of their darkest hours. He had fought against the army, protected his village, and watched helplessly as everything he loved was destroyed or taken away. His wife and young daughter had died in a cavalry raid 5 years ago, and since then he had been adrift. First, in the reservation system, then in a series of increasingly desperate circumstances that had led him to this platform. Aianu had learned to make his face into a mask, to show nothing of what he felt inside. He stood perfectly still, while Morrison pointed him out to potential customers, describing his impressive physical specifications like he was a horse at auction. Inside, a part of him wanted to leap from the platform and strangle the man with his bare hands, but he had learned that such impulses led only to worse circumstances, and he needed the dollar he might earn to buy food for himself and the other men who had no one else to depend on. He was focused on keeping his breathing steady and his expression neutral when he noticed the small figure approaching the platform. A little girl with Apache features was staring up at him with no fear whatsoever in her dark eyes. Behind her, an older white man was trying to catch up, calling her name. "Keya, wait!" But she paid him no attention. The girl stopped directly in front of Aianu and tilted her head back to meet his eyes. For a moment, time seemed suspended. He found himself looking down at a face that reminded him painfully of his own lost daughter. The same determined chin, the same fearless curiosity, the same way of looking at the world like it held endless possibilities. "You're very tall," Keya said simply, as if she were commenting on the weather. Aianu blinked, startled out of his carefully maintained composure. In the 3 days he'd been standing on this platform, no one had spoken directly to him. People walked about him, around him, sometimes at him, but never to him, like he was a human being with thoughts and feelings. Before he could think of a response, the girl turned to Morrison, who had been watching this interaction with growing interest. "How much did you say?" she asked. $1, little miss, Morrison replied with an oily smile. Though I'm not sure a child your age— I'll take the giant one, Keya announced, pointing up at Aianu with absolute certainty. The crowd murmured and chuckled. Morrison's smile widened. This was the kind of spectacle that drew crowds and made stories people would tell for years. Well now, Morrison said loudly, playing to his audience. Looks like we have our first customer of the day. Though I think you might need to ask your daddy there for the money, little miss. Pete finally reached them, slightly out of breath and wearing an expression of mortified embarrassment. He took Keya's hand gently but firmly. I'm sorry, he said. To Morrison, she's just curious about everything. We'll be going now. But Keya dug in her heels with the stubborn determination that Pete knew all too well. I want to hire him, Grandfather Pete. I have my allowance money. She pulled a cloth purse from her dress pocket and began counting out coins with the serious concentration of a banker. Pete watched in amazement as she produced exactly $1 in nickels and pennies, money she'd been saving for weeks to buy a new hair ribbon. Keya, sweetheart, Pete said quietly, kneeling down to her level. You don't understand what this is about. I understand perfectly, she said with the confidence that only children possessed. He looks sad, and he's standing all alone up there while everyone else gets to walk around. That's not fair. Pete glanced up at Aianu, who was staring down at them with an expression of such complete bewilderment that it was almost heartbreaking. The big man's carefully constructed walls had been breached by the simple kindness of a child who saw injustice and wanted to fix it. Morrison was practically rubbing his hands together with glee. Well, well, looks like we have a genuine transaction here, folks. $1 for 1 day's service from our largest Apache brave, purchased by our smallest customer. Pete felt trapped. He could see the crowd was enjoying the spectacle, and he knew that refusing now would only make things worse for everyone involved. But more than that, he saw something in Keya's eyes that he recognized. The same fierce compassion that her mother had possessed, the same inability to walk away from. Someone who needed help. With a sigh that seemed to come from his very soul, Pete reached into his own pocket and added the $1 to Keya's coins. All right, he said quietly. But this is your responsibility, you understand? You chose him, so you're going to treat him with respect and kindness. Keya nodded solemnly and handed the money to Morrison, who made a great show of conducting the transaction. He rang a small bell and announced to the crowd that they had witnessed the purchase of genuine Apache services by the youngest customer in Morrison Brothers history. Aianu stepped down from the platform with the careful dignity of a man trying to maintain his composure in an impossible situation. Up close, he was even more imposing, not just because of his size, but because of the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him despite his circumstances. I am called Aianu, he said to Pete in carefully pronounced English, his voice deep and carefully controlled. Pete McKinnon, Pete replied, extending his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Aianu shook it, a firm, respectful grip that spoke of ingrained courtesy despite everything he'd endured. Keya looked up at both men and smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had accomplished exactly what she set out to do. I'm Keya, she announced, and now we're going to be friends. As they walked away from the carnival grounds together, the elderly white man, the small Apache girl, and the towering warrior, Pete couldn't help but wonder what exactly his granddaughter had set in motion. Behind them, he could hear Morrison already using their transaction as part of his sales pitch for the remaining men on the platform. But when he looked down at Keya, skipping along between him and Aianu, like this was the most natural thing in the world, Pete found himself hoping that maybe, just maybe, something good might come from this strange beginning. The sun was beginning to set over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Aianu of the desert sunsets of his childhood. As they walked toward Pete's modest house on the edge of town, he found himself wondering if the little girl who had chosen him with such certainty had any idea that she had just changed the course of 3 lives forever. The silver dollar felt heavier in Morrison's palm than any coin had a right to feel. He turned it over slowly, examining the worn eagle on one side and Lady Liberty on the other, while his eyes remained fixed on the unusual trio walking away from his platform. In his 15 years of running traveling shows, he'd seen plenty of curiosities and oddities, but nothing quite like what had just transpired. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered under his breath, pocketing the coin. "That little girl just made history." Back on the platform, the remaining 6 Apache men watched their companion walk away with expressions that ranged from envy to concern. They had all grown protective of Aianu during their time together. His quiet strength and leadership had emerged naturally, even in their degraded circumstances. But none of them had expected to see him led away by a child and an old white man. Aianu himself was struggling to process what had just happened. In the 5 years since he'd lost everything, he had trained himself not to hope for kindness from strangers. Hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. It made the inevitable disappointments too painful to bear. Yet here he was, walking beside a little girl who had looked at him and seen something worth choosing, something worth her carefully saved allowance money. "Grandfather Pete," Keya said, swinging their joined hands as they walked. "What kind of work does Aianu do?" Pete glanced nervously at their silent companion. The truth was, he had no idea what to do with an Apache warrior for a day. His small homestead ran smoothly enough with just himself and Keya, and he'd never needed to hire help for anything he couldn't handle on his own. "Well," Pete said carefully, "I suppose we'll figure that out together. What would you like him to help us with?" Keya considered this question with the seriousness of a child who had just made her first major purchase. "Maybe he could help me build a better fort in the backyard, or teach me to whittle like you do, or, oh," her eyes lit up with sudden inspiration, "maybe he knows how to make those pretty baskets like the Apache ladies who sometimes come to town." Aianu had been listening to this exchange with growing bewilderment. He spoke enough English to follow their conversation, but their casual assumption that he would want to engage in domestic activities with them was completely outside his experience. In his world, transactions were business, cold, impersonal, exchanges of labor for money, yet this child seemed to expect something entirely different. As they approached Pete's house, a modest but well-maintained structure with a wide front porch and a neat vegetable garden, Aianu found himself noticing details that spoke of a life lived with care and intention. The fence posts were straight and properly spaced, the garden rows were weed-free, and the porch steps had been recently painted. This was the home of a man who took pride in his surroundings. "This is where we live," Keya announced, as if Aianu couldn't see that for himself. "Would you like some lemonade? Grandfather Pete makes the best lemonade in the whole territory." Pete cleared his throat awkwardly. "Keya, maybe we should—" "Yes," Aianu said quietly, surprising them both. "Thank you." It was the first full sentence he had spoken since introducing himself, and his voice carried a formal politeness that suggested he had been raised with proper manners, despite whatever circumstances had led him to Morrison's platform. Pete gestured toward the porch chairs. "Please sit down. I'll get the lemonade." As Pete disappeared into the house, Keya settled herself in the chair next to Ayanu's, her legs swinging freely since her feet didn't reach the floor. For a moment they sat in comfortable silence, watching the last light of day paint the western sky in brilliant colors. "You have scars," Keya observed with the matter-of-fact directness that only children possessed. Ayanu's hand unconsciously moved to his left forearm, where a long white line marked an old knife wound. He had others: bullet scars, claw marks, from a bear encounter, the inevitable collection of marks that came from a life lived in conflict and wilderness. "Yes," he said simply. "Do they hurt?" "Not anymore." Keya nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "I have a scar, too. See?" She pushed up her sleeve to reveal a small, crescent-shaped mark near her elbow. "I fell out of a tree last summer. Grandfather..." Pete said I was lucky I didn't break my arm. Aianu found himself studying the child more carefully. Her fearlessness around him was remarkable, but there was something else, a quality of resilience that reminded him of Apache children who had learned early that life could be harsh and unpredictable. "You climb trees," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "All the time." Keya's face lit up with enthusiasm. "There's a big oak behind the house that's perfect for climbing. I can get almost to the top now." "Do you climb trees?" The question caught Aianu off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked him about something as simple and joyful as climbing trees? "When I was young," he said carefully, "my people, we climbed cliffs mostly, to see far distances, to watch for enemies." "That sounds exciting," Keya said with genuine interest. "Were you a soldier?" The innocent question hit Aianu like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind. Cavalry charges, burning villages, the sound of gunfire echoing off canyon walls, the weight of command, the impossible decisions, the faces of men who had followed him into battle and never returned home. "Yes," he said quietly, "I was a soldier." Pete emerged from the house carrying a tray with 3 glasses of lemonade and a plate of sugar cookies. He moved carefully, clearly still adjusting to the surreal situation of serving refreshments to an Apache warrior on his front porch. "Here we are," Pete said, setting the tray on the small table between the chairs. "Keya's right about the lemonade. It's my grandmother's recipe." Aianu accepted the glass with both hands, a gesture of respect that didn't go unnoticed by Pete. The lemonade was indeed excellent, tart and sweet in perfect balance, with just a hint of mint from Pete's garden. "Thank you," Aianu said formally. "This is very good." Keya had already claimed 2 cookies and was working on her lemonade with the focused attention of someone who took refreshments seriously. "Grandfather Pete," she said between sips, "Aianu was a soldier like you were." Pete nearly choked on his lemonade. He had never told Keya about his military service. It was a part of his past that he preferred to keep buried. But clearly she had picked up more from adult conversations than he had realized. "Is that so?" Pete said carefully, glancing at Aianu with new interest and not a little wariness. Aianu met his eyes steadily. "Apache," he said simply, as if that explained everything, which in many ways it did. The 2 men looked at each other across the small table, each trying to gauge what the other might have done during the long, bitter conflict that had finally ended just a few years ago. Pete saw intelligence and dignity in Ayanu's face, but also the kind of controlled watchfulness that came from years of looking over one's shoulder. Aianu saw an old soldier trying to live peacefully, but carrying the same shadows that haunted anyone who had seen too much war. "Well," Pete said finally, "that's behind us now?" "Yes," Aianu agreed quietly, "behind us." Keya, oblivious to the undercurrents of their exchange, had finished her lemonade and was studying Aianu with the intense focus of a child working out a problem. "Why were you standing on that platform?" she asked suddenly. Pete winced. He had been dreading this question, hoping somehow to avoid having to explain the realities of their situation to his granddaughter. Aianu was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "I needed work," he said finally. "Money for food. But you were just standing there," Keya pressed. "That's not work." "Keya," Pete said gently, "sometimes grown-ups have to do things they don't like in order to survive." "That's not fair," Keya declared with the absolute moral certainty of a 7-year-old. "Nobody should have to stand on a platform like a horse at auction." Her words hit both men with unexpected force. From the mouth of a child, the injustice of the situation was laid bare with devastating clarity. Aianu looked down at his hands wrapped around the lemonade glass. "Life is not always fair, little one." "Maybe not," Keya said stubbornly, "but that doesn't mean we can't try to make it better." As the evening shadows lengthened around them, the 3 unlikely companions sat in contemplative silence. None of them could have imagined that morning how the day would end, but somehow it felt right. This quiet moment of shared refreshment and tentative connection, the silver dollar in Morrison's pocket, had purchased more than a day's labor. It had bought the beginning of something that none of them fully understood yet, but all of them sensed was important. For the first time in years, Aianu found himself wondering what tomorrow might bring, and the thought didn't fill him with dread. That, in itself, was a kind of miracle. Dawn broke grey and uncertain over Cedar Ridge, with clouds promising rain that might never come. Aianu had spent the night in Pete's barn, despite the old man's awkward offer of the spare room. The barn felt safer somehow, familiar in its simplicity, with clean straw and the comforting presence of Pete's old mare, Belle. He had slept better than he had in months, though he couldn't quite understand why. From his vest pocket, he withdrew a small object that he kept wrapped in soft deerskin, a broken arrowhead, chipped and worn smooth by years of handling. It was all he had left from his last battle, the day his world had ended. The iron point was bent and the wooden shaft long gone, but he carried it still, a reminder of what he had been and what he had lost. The sound of footsteps in the yard drew his attention. Through the barn's open door, he could see Keya skipping toward him, her hair braided neatly and her dress already showing signs of morning adventures. Behind her, Pete followed at a more measured pace, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Good morning," Keya called out cheerfully. "Did you sleep well? I told Grandfather Pete you might like coffee, but I wasn't sure how you'd take it." Aianu carefully wrapped the arrowhead and tucked it away before emerging from the barn. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. "I slept well, thank you. Coffee would be welcome." Pete handed him one of the cups, noting how Ayanu's large hands dwarfed the ceramic mug. "It's black," Pete said. "Didn't know if you wanted sugar or cream." "Black is good." Aianu took a careful sip and nodded approvingly. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what a working man needed to start his day. "So," Keya said, bouncing slightly on her toes, "what are we going to do today? I've been thinking about it all night, and I have lots of ideas." Pete chuckled despite his nervousness about the situation. "Well, the paying customer gets to decide, I suppose. What did you have in mind, sweetheart?" Keya's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "First, I want to show Aianu my fort, then maybe he could help me make it stronger, and then, oh, could you teach me some Apache words? I only know a few, and I want to learn more." Aianu nearly choked on his coffee. In all his imagining of how this strange arrangement might unfold, he had never considered that the child might want to learn his language. Most white people seem to consider Apache nothing more than savage gibberish. "You know Apache words?" he asked, genuinely curious. "A little," Keya said, suddenly shy. "Mama taught me some before she died, but I think I might be saying them wrong." Pete's face tightened slightly at the mention of Keya's mother, but he remained silent. This was territory he had never fully explored with his granddaughter, partly because his own knowledge of her mother's background was limited. "What words do you know?" Aianu asked gently. Keya took a deep breath and spoke carefully. "Shiai Keya yinishe, dikwi shiu hoju." Ayanu's coffee cup stopped, halfway to his lips. The child's pronunciation was nearly perfect, with only the slight accent that came from learning words without understanding their full context. But more than that, what she had said struck him to his core. "Your mother taught you this?" he asked quietly. "Yes. She said it was important for me to know. Do I have it right?" "Yes," Aianu said, his voice rougher than he intended. "You said my name is Keya. I am happy. Your pronunciation is very good." What he didn't tell her was that she had spoken in the specific dialect of the Chiricahua Apache, his people. It could be a coincidence, but something about the way she formed the words suggested deeper familiarity than casual contact would provide. Pete watched this exchange with growing interest and concern. "Her mother never told me she spoke Apache," he said carefully. "Maybe she was saving it for when I was older," Keya suggested. "She said there were lots of things she would teach me when I was ready." The 3 of them stood in the morning light, each lost in their own thoughts about the mysteries that connected them. Finally, Keya broke the contemplative silence with characteristic determination. "Come on," she said, grabbing Aianu's free hand without hesitation. "I want to show you my fort." She led them around to the back of the house, where a cluster of oak trees provided natural shelter. Between two of the largest trunks, Keya had constructed what she generously called a fort, a lean-to made of salvaged boards, old blankets, and childish optimism. It was clearly the work of someone with big dreams and limited carpentry skills. "I built it myself," she announced proudly, "but the roof leaks when it rains, and one wall keeps falling down." Aianu walked around the structure, examining it with the same serious attention he might give to defensive fortifications. He could see immediately what the problems were. The supports weren't properly braced, the roof angle was wrong for shedding water, and the foundation was uneven. "It has good potential," he said diplomatically. "With some adjustments, it could be very strong." "Really?" Keya's face lit up. "You could help me fix it?" "If that is what you would like." Pete found himself watching Aianu with growing respect. The big man was treating Keya's childish construction project with the same dignity he might show to adult concerns. There was no condescension in his manner, no impatience with her enthusiasm. "I'll get some tools," Pete offered. "Might as well do this right." As Pete headed back to the house, Keya climbed into her fort and patted the ground beside her. "Sit with me for a minute," she said. "I want to ask you something." Aianu had to duck considerably to fit through the low entrance, but he managed to squeeze his large frame into the small space. Sitting cross-legged beside Keya, he felt transported back to his own childhood when he had built similar shelters. "In the mountains of his homeland, this reminds me of shelters my people built when traveling," he said softly. "Quick protection from weather and enemies." "Did you build forts when you were little?" "Yes, but ours were usually hidden, built into glyphs or caves. We learned early to make ourselves invisible." Keya considered this seriously. "That sounds scary." "Sometimes it was," Aianu admitted, "but it was also necessary. My people had many enemies. Do you miss it? Your old life?" The question was so direct, so innocent, that Aianu found himself answering more honestly than he had intended. "I miss my family. I miss feeling like I belonged somewhere." "You belong here now," Keya said with absolute certainty. "Grandfather Pete and I decided last night you can stay as long as you want." Aianu looked down at this small, fierce child who spoke with such confidence about things far beyond her understanding. "It is not that simple, little one. I am Apache. Your grandfather is white. People in town will not understand." "Then people in town are stupid," Keya declared with finality. Despite everything, his grief, his uncertainty, his careful emotional walls, Aianu found himself smiling. When was the last time he had smiled? He couldn't remember. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but the world is what it is." "Maybe," Keya said, leaning against his arm with casual affection, "but that doesn't mean we can't try to make our little part of it better." As they sat together in her ramshackle fort, watching the morning light filter through the oak leaves above them, Aianu felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of pain and anger that had lived there for so long. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was the first suggestion that healing might be possible. When Pete returned with an armload of tools, he found them planning improvements with the serious concentration of military engineers. Watching them work, together, the giant warrior and the tiny girl, he began to think that maybe Keya's impulsive decision the day before had been wiser than any of them realized. The photograph was faded and creased from years of careful handling, its sepia tones softened by time and love. Pete had kept it in his bedroom drawer, wrapped in tissue paper, taking it out only on the darkest nights when grief threatened to overwhelm him. But tonight felt different. Tonight he carried it down to the kitchen, where Aianu sat teaching Keya to carve simple shapes from pieces of cedar. "Careful with the knife, little one. Aianu was saying, his large hands guiding Keya's. Smaller ones! Let the wood tell you where it wants to be cut. They had been working together for 3 days now, and the transformation in all of them was remarkable. Keya glowed with the attention and new skills she was learning. Aianu seemed to shed a little, more of his wariness each day, his movements becoming less guarded, his rare smiles coming more easily. And Pete found himself remembering what it felt like to have a complete family around his table. Keya, Pete said quietly, settling into his chair across from them. I want to show you something I should have shared long ago. He placed the photograph on the table between them, his weathered fingers trembling slightly. The image showed a young Apache woman holding an infant, her face serious but gentle, her traditional dress beautifully detailed with intricate beadwork. Keya's knife stopped, moving. She stared at the photograph with wide eyes, her small face cycling through confusion, recognition, and wonder. Is that, she whispered, your mother? Pete said softly. Her name was Desba. This was taken about a week before she died. Aianu had gone completely still. His eyes were fixed on the photograph with an intensity that made Pete suddenly uneasy. The big man's face had gone pale, and his hands gripped the edge of the table. Where did you get this? Aianu asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Desba had it with her when I found her, Pete replied, confused by the intensity of Ayanu's reaction. She was sick, nearly dying, but she made sure I understood how important it was to keep it safe for Keya. Aianu reached toward the photograph with a shaking hand, then stopped himself. May I? Pete nodded, watching in bewilderment as Aianu lifted the photograph with infinite care. The warrior's eyes filled with tears that he made no attempt to hide. Desba, he said, and the name was both a prayer and a lament. My brother's wife, my little niece. The words hung in the air like smoke from a sacred fire. Pete felt the world tilt around him as the implications crashed over him. Keya stared up at Aianu with dawning wonder. You knew my mama? She asked in a small voice. I knew your mama, Aianu confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. I knew your father too. He was my younger brother, Naiche. You have his eyes and your mother's stubborn spirit. Pete sank back in his chair, his mind reeling. All these years, he had wondered about Keya's family, about the circumstances that had brought Desba to his door that terrible winter night. Now, the pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Your brother, Pete said slowly. What happened to him? Aianu's face darkened with old pain. Killed by cavalry soldiers 3 years before Desba came to you. She was pregnant then, carrying Keya, but she was afraid. The reservation was no place for a woman alone with a child. She ran. She was trying to protect me, Keya said, understanding, dawning in her young eyes. Yes, little butterfly, Aianu said, using an Apache endearment that made Pete's chest tighten. She was very brave. She knew the winter would be hard, knew she might not survive, but she wanted you to have a chance at a safe life. The 3 of them sat in silence for a moment, each processing this revelation in their own way. Finally, Keya spoke up with the practical directness that Pete had come to expect from her. So you're my uncle, she said to Aianu, my real uncle. By blood, yes, Aianu replied carefully, but Pete is your grandfather in every way that matters. He has loved you and cared for you. That bond is just as real. Pete felt a surge of gratitude toward this man who could have claimed Keya as his own, but instead chose to honor the relationship that had sustained her for the past 5 years. It was a generosity of spirit that spoke to Aianu's character more than any words could. This explains so much, Pete said quietly. Why she took to you so quickly, why the Apache words came so naturally. She recognized something in you. Blood calls to blood, Aianu agreed. But more than that, I think she sensed that you and I have something in common. What's that? Aianu looked directly at Pete, his dark eyes holding depths of shared understanding. We have both lost children we loved. We both know what it means to fail someone who depended on us. The words hit Pete like a physical blow. In all their careful conversations over the past few days, neither man had spoken directly about their losses, but both had recognized the weight the other carried. "You didn't fail, Desbar," Pete said firmly. "You couldn't have known I was her brother-in-law. I should have protected her, should have found a way to keep her safe when Nietzsche died. Instead, I was too consumed with my own grief, my own anger, at the world, and I failed my own daughter." Pete admitted, the words coming out like a confession. "I was so caught up in my duty as a soldier that I didn't see what the war was doing to her. When she needed me most, I wasn't there." Keya looked back and forth between the two men, her young mind working to understand the complex web of guilt and regret that connected them. Finally, she set down her carving knife and climbed into Pete's lap, then reached out to take Aianu's large hand in her small one. "You didn't fail anybody," she said with the absolute certainty that only a child could muster. "Mama chose to come to Grandfather Pete because she knew he was good, and she would be happy that I found you, Uncle Aianu, because family is supposed to be together." The simple wisdom of her words cut through years of self-recrimination for both men. Pete pulled her closer, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, while Aianu gently squeezed her hand. "When did you get so wise, little butterfly?" Aianu asked softly. "I've always been wise," Keya replied matter-of-factly. "You just haven't been listening long enough." That night, after Keya had been tucked into bed with promises that Aianu would still be there in the morning, the two men sat on the front porch, sharing a bottle of whiskey that Pete had been saving for a special occasion. The stars were brilliant. Overhead, unpolluted by the electric lights that were beginning to appear in larger cities. "I have something else that belonged to your family," Pete said, reaching into his vest pocket. He withdrew the worn leather medicine pouch that he had carried since Desbar's death. "She asked me to keep this safe, said it was important. I've been carrying it ever since, but I think it belongs with you." Aianu accepted the pouch with reverent hands. He could smell the faint scent of sage and sweetgrass that still clung to the leather, could feel the familiar weight of the sacred objects inside. His grandmother had made this pouch for Desbar when she married Nietzsche, filling it with protective herbs and stones blessed by the medicine man. "She never stopped being Apache," he said quietly. "Even when she had to live in your world, she carried our ways with her." "She was raising Keya to know both worlds," Pete said, "teaching her English and Apache, white customs and tribal traditions. She wanted her daughter to be strong enough to bridge any gap, and you continued that work, even without understanding it fully." Pete nodded. "I did my best, but she needs more than I can give her. She needs to know where she comes from, who her people are. Her people are here," Aianu said firmly. "You and me, this house, this life you've built together, the blood matters, but the love matters more." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two men who had found an unexpected brotherhood in their shared devotion to a little girl who had somehow saved them both. "The townspeople won't like this," Pete said eventually. "They barely tolerate me having an Apache granddaughter. When they find out I'm harboring an Apache warrior in my home, we'll face that when it comes," Aianu replied. "For now, we have today. We have tomorrow. We have each other." Inside the house, Keya slept peacefully, dreaming of strong hands, teaching her to carve, of stories told in two languages, of a family that was complicated and imperfect but undeniably real. She had gone to sleep clutching the faded photograph, her mother's face the last thing she saw before closing her eyes. And for the first time since Desbar's death, Pete went to sleep without the weight of that empty medicine pouch in his pocket, feeling like a piece of his granddaughter's heritage had finally found its way home. The discovery came purely by accident, the way truth often does when it's been carefully hidden. Keya had been exploring the carnival grounds while Pete conducted business in town, and Aianu repaired a broken fence post. She moved through the maze of wagons and tents with the fearless curiosity of a child who had learned that most adults would indulge her questions if she smiled sweetly enough. Morrison's private wagon sat at the edge of the carnival, larger and more ornate than the others, with brass fixtures that caught the afternoon sunlight. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, Keya could see something that made her heart race with excitement. Hanging from hooks along the wagon's interior walls were dozens of beautiful objects, jewelry, pottery, woven baskets, and carved figurines. But it was the strand of prayer beads near the window that captured her attention completely. They were unlike anything she had ever seen, each bead carved with intricate symbols and connected by sinew that had been dyed deep red with natural pigments. She knew instinctively that these belonged to Aianu's people. Without hesitation, she pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The wagon smelled of tobacco and unwashed clothes, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the treasures that filled every available surface, clearly Apache artifacts that had been collected from who knew where. "Well, well," came a voice behind her. "What do we have here?" Keya spun around to find Morrison standing in the doorway, his usual showman's smile replaced by something harder and less friendly. "I was just looking," she said, instinctively backing toward the beads. "Looking at things that don't belong to you, little miss." Morrison stepped into the wagon, effectively blocking her exit. "These are valuable collector's items, not toys. For curious children." "They're not collector's items," Keya said, with the indignation that only a 7-year-old could muster. "They're sacred things. They belong to the Apache people, not in your wagon." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "And how would a little white girl know anything about Apache sacred objects?" "Because my uncle told me about them," Keya replied without thinking. "Your uncle?" Morrison laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "You mean that savage I sold you? Child, that man isn't your uncle any more than I'm your grandfather." "He is too my uncle." Keya's voice rose with anger and hurt. "And he's not a savage. He's kind and smart, and he knows about important things." Morrison studied her with the calculating gaze of a man who smelled opportunity. "Is that so? Well, then perhaps your uncle would be interested in buying back some of his people's belongings. I'm sure we could work out an arrangement." Before Keya could respond, the wagon door swung wide open and Aianu filled the doorway. His face was thunderous as he took in the scene. Morrison looming over Keya, the collection of stolen artifacts surrounding them. "Step away from her," Aianu said quietly, but his voice carried the kind of authority that made Morrison immediately. "Comply." Keya ran to Aianu, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Uncle Aianu, look, he has Apache things in here, beautiful things that should belong to your people." Ayanu's eyes swept the wagon's interior, cataloging each stolen piece with the precision of a man who had spent years tracking what was lost. He recognized some of the items: a medicine bundle that had belonged to his grandmother, a war shield that had been carried by his father, prayer beads that had been blessed by the tribal medicine man. "Where did you get these?" he asked Morrison. His voice deadly calm. Morrison had recovered some of his swagger, emboldened by the reminder that he was, technically, the legal owner of everything in the wagon. Bought and paid for every piece, sometimes from reservations, sometimes from settlers who came across abandoned camps. All perfectly legal. "Legal?" Aianu repeated, the word carrying a weight of bitter irony. "Yes, I suppose it would be legal. To steal from people who have no legal standing to protect their property." "Now see here," Morrison blustered, "I resent the implication that I'm some kind of thief. These items were acquired through legitimate transactions." "Legitimate," Aianu said, reaching out to touch one of the prayer beads with infinite gentleness. "Like selling human beings for $1 a day is legitimate?" The tension in the small space was palpable. Keya could feel the anger radiating from Aianu, but also something deeper, a profound grief for all that had been lost and stolen from his people. "I want to buy them back," she announced suddenly, her clear voice cutting through the thick atmosphere. Both men stared down at her in surprise. "Keya," Aianu said gently, "these things cost much more than $1. "Then I'll earn the money." she declared with fierce determination. "I'll do chores for everyone in town. I'll save every penny. That's very touching," Morrison interrupted, with false sympathy, "but I'm afraid a child's allowance won't cover the cost of genuine Native American artifacts. These pieces are worth hundreds of dollars to the right collectors." Aianu's jaw tightened. The man was right, of course. Even if Pete were willing to help, they could never afford to buy back what had been stolen. But seeing Keya's distress, a genuine desire to right this wrong, made his heart ache with both pride and helplessness. "There might be another way," Morrison said slowly, his showman's instincts picking up on an opportunity. "I'm always looking for new attractions for the show. A genuine Apache family, grandfather, daughter, and uncle. Now that would draw crowds. Especially if the uncle was willing to demonstrate some of those savage fighting skills that made his people so feared." The suggestion hung in the air like a physical thing. Aianu felt his chest tighten with rage and humiliation. The man was proposing to turn their newfound family into a carnival act, to exploit their love for each other as entertainment for curious crowds. "No," he said simply. "Think about it," Morrison pressed. "Good money, travel to interesting places, and all these artifacts returned to their rightful owners. It's a fair trade." "There is nothing fair about it," Aianu replied. "These things were stolen. They should be returned freely, not used as bait for more exploitation." Morrison shrugged. "Well then, I suppose they'll remain part of my private collection. I do get quite a bit of enjoyment from them." Keya looked back and forth between the two men, her young mind working furiously to find a solution that adult logic had failed to provide. Finally, she turned to Morrison with the kind of sweet smile that usually got her whatever she wanted. "Mr. Morrison," she said politely, "don't you think it would make you feel good to do something nice, to give these beautiful things back to the people they belong to?" Morrison actually laughed. "Child, feeling good doesn't pay for food or lodging or the upkeep of a traveling show. Sentiment is a luxury I can't afford." As they left the wagon, Aianu carrying Keya, and both of them weighted down by the injustice they had witnessed, neither of them noticed the figure watching from behind a nearby tent. Sheriff Tom Bradley had heard enough of their conversation to understand the situation, and his weathered face was creased with the kind of deep thought that usually preceded either trouble or justice, sometimes both. That evening, word began to spread through Cedar Ridge about the confrontation at the carnival. By morning, the town would be buzzing with opinions about the Apache warrior who was living with old Pete McKinnon, and not all of those opinions would be friendly. The medal lay heavy in Pete's weathered hands, its bronze surface tarnished by decades of being hidden away like a shameful secret. The Congressional Medal of Honor bore the inscription, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." But to Pete, it felt more like a millstone around his neck. He had avoided this conversation for a week now, ever since the confrontation at Morrison's wagon had set the whole town talking. People were asking questions about why he was harboring an Apache warrior, what his real intentions were, whether he could be trusted to raise an Indian child properly. The answers to those questions led inevitably back to places Pete had sworn never to revisit. Aianu sat across from him at the kitchen table, teaching Keya to braid sinew into cord for a small dream catcher they were making together. The domestic scene should have been peaceful, but Pete could feel the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on all of them. "Uncle Aianu," Keya said, her small fingers working carefully with the thin strands. "Tell me again about the dreamcatcher spirits." "The web catches bad dreams," Aianu explained patiently, "but lets good dreams pass through to reach the sleeping person. It protects children especially, because their spirits are still learning to be strong." "Did you have one when you were little?" "Yes. My grandmother made it for me after my first nightmare about soldiers." The innocent comment hit Pete like a physical blow. He looked up to find Aianu watching him with those dark, knowing eyes, and suddenly the weight of the medal in his hands became unbearable. "I need to tell you something." Pete said quietly, setting the medal on the table between them. Aianu's. And stilled on the dream catcher, his eyes fixed on the medal with recognition that made Pete's stomach clench with dread. I know what this is, Aianu said softly. Do you? Pete's voice was barely a whisper. Do you know what I did to earn it? Keya looked back and forth between them, sensing the sudden tension but not understanding its source. What's wrong? What is that thing? It's a medal, Pete said, forcing himself to meet Aianu's gaze. The government gives them to soldiers who do things they consider heroic. That's good, isn't it? Keya asked. It means you were brave. Sometimes being brave and being right aren't the same thing, sweetheart, Pete said, his voice thick with old pain. I was a lieutenant in the 4th Cavalry, stationed at Fort Apache. We were ordered to relocate Apache families to the San Carlos reservation. Aianu's face had gone perfectly still, but Pete could see the tension coiling in his shoulders like a spring being wound too tight. It was supposed to be a peaceful transfer, Pete continued, the words coming out like a confession. But the families didn't want to leave their traditional lands. They scattered into the mountains, hoping to avoid capture. Grandfather Pete, Keya said uncertainly, why are you telling us this? Because your uncle deserves to know who I really am, Pete replied. Who I was back then. He picked up the medal again, studying its familiar weight. There was a family, hiding in Devil's Canyon, a man, his wife, and 2 small children. My superior officer wanted to use dynamite to force them out, but I convinced him to let me try talking to them first. Aianu's breathing had become carefully controlled, but his hands gripped the edge of the table hard enough to make his knuckles white. I climbed up to their hiding place alone, Pete went on. The man had been wounded in an earlier skirmish, couldn't fight anymore. His wife was terrified, trying to protect the children. They looked at me like I was death itself come calling. What did you do? Keya asked in a small voice. I told them I would help them escape if they would trust me. I gave them my horse, my water, everything I could spare. Pointed them toward Mexico and told them to ride hard and fast. Pete's voice broke slightly. I earned this medal by letting an Apache family escape, then lying to my commanding officer about what happened. Told him they were already gone when I reached their hiding place. The silence that followed was deafening. Keya stared at Pete with wide eyes, trying to process what she had heard. Aianu sat perfectly motionless, his face unreadable. But that's good, Keya said finally. You helped them. You saved them. Did I? Pete asked bitterly. I saved one family, but I was part of a system that destroyed hundreds of others. I wore the uniform. I followed the orders. I participated in breaking up families and forcing people from their homes. Aianu spoke for the first time since Pete had begun his confession. What was the man's name? The one you helped escape? Pete's face went pale. I don't remember his Apache name. In our reports, he was listed as John Crow Feather. The name hit Aianu like a physical blow. His chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly, his large frame suddenly seeming to fill the entire kitchen. Crow Feather was my cousin, he said, his voice deadly quiet. He died of his wounds 3 days after crossing into Mexico. His wife and children starved that winter because they had no one to hunt for them. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Pete felt the blood drain from his face as the full weight of coincidence, or perhaps fate, crashed down on him. Aianu, he whispered, I didn't know. You didn't know because you never asked. Aianu's control finally snapped, his voice rising with years of suppressed rage. None of you ever asked our names, our stories, what we were leaving behind. We were just problems to be solved, obstacles to be moved. Keya scrambled out of her chair and ran to Pete, throwing her arms around his waist. Don't yell at Grandfather Pete, she cried. He was trying to help. Help? Aianu turned his anguish on her, his face twisted with pain. He helped one man die slowly instead of quickly. He helped tear apart families and call it mercy. That's enough, Pete said quietly, standing and placing protective hands on Keya's shoulders. You're scaring her. She should be scared, Aianu shot back. She should know what kind of man raised her, what kind of blood is on his hands. The accusation cut deeper than any physical blow could have. Pete had carried his guilt for 30 years, but hearing it spoken aloud by someone who had lived through the consequences of his actions made it fresh and raw again. "You're right," he said simply. "You're absolutely right. I've got blood on my hands, and no amount of good intentions can wash it clean. But that little girl is innocent of everything that came before her. Don't make her pay for my sins." Aianu looked down at Keya, who was crying now, confused and frightened by the sudden explosion of adult anger and pain. The sight of her tears seemed to drain the rage out of him, leaving only exhaustion and sorrow. "I need to think," he said finally. "I need time to—" He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he walked out of the kitchen, through the front door, and into the gathering dusk. Pete and Keya heard his footsteps on the porch, then the sound of him walking away into the night. Keya cried herself to sleep that night, clutching the half-finished dream catcher and asking over and over when Uncle Aianu was coming home. Pete sat beside her bed until her breathing deepened into sleep, then went to his own room and stared out the window at the empty darkness, wondering if he had just lost the best thing that had happened to his family in years. 3 days passed without word from Aianu. Pete went through the motions of daily life, cooking meals, tending his small garden, maintaining his usual routines, but his heart wasn't in it. Keya had grown quiet and withdrawn, spending hours staring out the window toward the path that led to town, waiting for a familiar figure to appear. On the 4th morning, she woke with a fever that made her small body shake with chills despite the summer heat. Pete tried everything he knew: cool cloths, willow bark tea, the remedies that had seen them through previous illnesses, but nothing seemed to help. By evening, her temperature had climbed dangerously high, and she had begun speaking in a mixture of English and Apache that she shouldn't have known. "Shiche," she mumbled in her delirium, the Apache word for grandfather tumbling from her lips with perfect pronunciation. "Shiche, where is Uncle Aianu? Why did he leave us?" Pete's hands trembled as he wrung out another cool cloth. The words she was speaking were beyond anything Desba could have taught her in her brief life, beyond anything she could have learned from their few conversations with Aianu. It was as if the fever had unlocked some deeper knowledge that had been lying dormant in her blood. By midnight, Pete's desperation overcame his pride. He saddled his old horse and rode into town, searching every saloon, boarding house, and camp where Aianu might have taken shelter. He found him finally in the livery stable, sleeping in an empty stall with his saddle as a pillow. "She's sick," Pete said without preamble, burning up with fever and speaking Apache words she never learned. "I need your help." Aianu was on his feet instantly, all their previous conflict forgotten in the face of Keya's need. They rode back to the house together in grim silence, both men focused entirely on the child who had somehow become the center of both their worlds. Keya was worse when they arrived. Her fever had spiked even higher, and she was tossing restlessly, calling out in Apache for family members who existed only in some deep genetic memory. "Shimasani," she cried, reaching toward shadows only she could see. "Grandmother, don't leave me alone." Aianu knelt beside her bed, his large hand gentle on her burning forehead. "I'm here, little butterfly," he said softly in Apache. "Your uncle is here." For a moment, her eyes focused on his face with startling clarity. "Uncle?" she whispered. In English, why do I know her voice? Why do I remember grandmother's songs when I never met her? The question sent a chill down both men's spines. Pete had been through Desba's few possessions many times over the years, searching for clues about Keya's heritage, but he had found nothing that might explain this supernatural connection to Apache ancestors she had never known. "Stay with her," Pete said, his voice rough with worry. "I'm going to look through her mother's things again. There has to be something I missed." He left Aianu singing traditional lullabies in Apache while he ransacked his bedroom, pulling out the small wooden box where he kept everything that had belonged to Desba. He had been through these items countless times, but desperation made him more thorough now, examining every seam and fold for hidden secrets. The dress was beautiful, even in its faded state. Traditional Apache clothing with intricate beadwork that told stories Pete had never learned to read. As he lifted it from the box, something crinkled inside the bodice. His fingers found a hidden pocket, sewn so cleverly into the construction that it was nearly invisible. Inside the pocket were several folded papers, their edges yellow with age. Pete's hands shook as he unfolded them, squinting at the faded ink in the lamplight. The first document was a marriage certificate, written in Spanish and English, dated 1878. It recorded the union between Naiche, son of Chief Cochise, and Desba, daughter of Geronimo. Pete's breath caught in his throat as he read the names. Keya wasn't just Apache. She was the grandchild of two of the most legendary leaders in Apache history. The second document was even more shocking. It was a birth certificate, but not for Keya, for a son named Naiche, born to a woman named Ishi in 1855. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added a note. Adopted by white family name McKinnon, 1856. White name, Thomas Peter. McKinnon! Pete stared at the paper in disbelief, reading the words over and over until their meaning finally sank in. Thomas Peter McKinnon. That was his full name. The name his adoptive parents had given him when they found him as a toddler after an Apache raid had left him orphaned and alone. He wasn't just raising an Apache granddaughter. He was Apache himself. The room seemed to spin around him as memories rushed back, fragments of dreams that he had always dismissed as childhood imagination. A woman's voice singing in a language he didn't recognize. The smell of sage smoke, the feeling of being carried on someone's back through tall grass. His adoptive parents had told him these were just fantasies, the confused memories of a traumatized child. But now he understood. Naiche hadn't been just any Apache warrior, he had been Pete's own brother. Desba hadn't come to him by accident. She had sought out the only family she had left, following some instinct or story that had led her to the white man who carried Apache blood. Pete stumbled back to Keya's room, the papers clutched in his trembling hands. Aianu looked up as he entered, and something in Pete's face made him go very still. "What did you find?" Aianu asked quietly. Pete handed him the documents without a word. Aianu read them slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to amazement, to something like awe. "Naiche, son of Cochise," Aianu breathed. "That makes Keya the great-granddaughter of Cochise," Pete finished. "And Geronimo's granddaughter and his voice broke, "my brother's daughter." Aianu stared at him with new understanding. "You're not just her adoptive grandfather. You're her blood relative." "I'm Apache," Pete said, the words strange on his tongue after a lifetime of believing otherwise. "I fought against my own people for 30 years and never knew it." The revelation hung between them like a bridge spanning decades of misunderstanding. Suddenly, so many things made sense. Pete's instinctive connection to Keya, his ability to see past racial prejudice when so many of his generation could not, the guilt that had haunted him since his military service. Keya stirred on the bed, her fever finally beginning to break. Her eyes opened and focused on both men with unusual clarity. "I dreamed about grandmother," she said softly. "She told me our family was all together now. She said the broken circle was finally complete." Pete reached out to touch her cooling forehead, marveling at how this child had somehow known what the adults had taken years to discover. "Yes, little one," he said gently. "Our family is complete." As dawn broke over Cedar Ridge, the three of them sat together in Keya's room. Not the unlikely combination of white grandfather, Apache uncle, and mixed-blood child they had appeared to be, but a true family bound by blood that ran deeper than any of them had imagined. The hidden documents lay on the bedside table, evidence of secrets that had shaped all their lives without their knowledge. But more important than the papers was the understanding that had passed between them, that family was both a choice and a destiny, and sometimes the two worked together in ways that defied logic or explanation. Outside, the town of Cedar Ridge was beginning to stir, unaware that the simple story of an old man and his adopted granddaughter had just become infinitely more complex. The legal implications alone would be staggering. If Pete's true heritage became known, if Keya's royal Apache bloodline was discovered, the careful life they had built together could be shattered by forces beyond their control. But for now, in the quiet sanctuary of the sick room, they were simply a family that had found itself against all odds, and that was enough. The knock on the door came at precisely 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the kind of official authority that made ordinary citizens feel guilty even when they had done nothing wrong. Pete opened it to find two men in dark suits. Standing on his porch, government agents with the unmistakable bearing of men who were accustomed to having their questions answered and their orders followed. "Mr. McKinnon," the taller of the two asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I'm Agent Harrison from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This is Agent Walsh. We'd like to speak with you about your living arrangements." Behind them, Pete could see Sheriff Bradley leaning against his horse, his weathered face carefully neutral, but his eyes sympathetic. The sheriff had clearly been recruited to make the official visit seem less threatening, but his presence only confirmed Pete's worst fears about how far word of their situation had traveled. "What kind of living arrangements?" Pete asked, though he knew perfectly well what they were talking about. "We understand you've been harboring an Apache male on your property," Agent Walsh said, consulting a small notebook, "and that you're raising a child of Apache heritage without proper oversight from the Bureau." Keya appeared at Pete's elbow, drawn by the unfamiliar voices. She studied the agents with the kind of frank curiosity that made adults uncomfortable, as if she could see through their official facades to whatever lay underneath. "Who are you?" she asked with characteristic directness. "We're from the government, little miss," Harrison said, with the patronizing tone that adults often used with children. "We're here to make sure you're being properly cared for." "I am being properly cared for," Keya replied firmly. "Grandfather Pete takes very good care of me, and so does Uncle Aianu." The agents exchanged glances at this confirmation of their intelligence reports. "Where is this uncle now?" Walsh asked. "Around back." "Working on the fence," Pete said reluctantly. There was no point in lying. They would find Aianu eventually, and deception would only make things worse. "We'll need to speak with him as well," Harrison said. "And we'll need to examine the child's living conditions, her education records, medical care documentation, everything that pertains to her welfare." Pete felt his chest tighten with the familiar panic that came from dealing with bureaucracy when you had something to hide. The documents he had discovered about his own heritage were still tucked away in his bedroom, but their very existence felt like a weight pressing down on him. If the agents discovered the truth about Keya's bloodline, if they learned that she was descended from Cochise and Geronimo, the political implications would be enormous. "Am I in trouble?" Keya asked, looking up at Pete with worry in her dark eyes. "No, sweetheart," Pete said quickly. "These men just need to ask some questions. Why don't you go find Uncle Aianu and tell him we have visitors?" As Keya ran off toward the back of the house, Pete invited the agents inside with the resigned courtesy of a man who knew he had no choice in the matter. They settled themselves in his small parlor like occupying forces, their eyes cataloguing every detail of the modest but well-maintained home. "You're not married, Mr. McKinnon?" Harrison asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. "Widowed. Many years ago. And you took in this Apache child. Why exactly?" Pete chose his words carefully. "Her mother was dying. She asked me to care for the child. I couldn't say no." "Very charitable of you," Walsh said dryly. "But surely you understand that Apache children are supposed to be placed with Apache families when possible, or at least in government-approved institutions designed to help them assimilate into white society." "Keya is assimilated," Pete said. "You firmly." She speaks perfect English. She's learning to read and write. She knows her numbers and her manners. She's as civilized as any child in this territory. But she's also been exposed to Apache influences, Harrison pointed out. We understand. There's been an Apache male living on the property for several weeks now. That's hardly conducive to proper assimilation. The sound of voices from the backyard announced Keya's return with Aianu. Pete could hear her chattering away in the mixture of English and Apache that had become natural to her, and he winced at how that would sound to government ears. Aianu appeared in the doorway with Keya at his side, his face carefully composed, but his eyes alert to the threat these strangers represented. He had clearly sensed the tension in the house before he even entered. "Gentlemen," he said with formal politeness, "I am called Aianu." "So we've heard," Harrison replied, not bothering to stand or offer his hand. "We're here to investigate reports of an irregular living situation involving this child." "What is irregular about a family caring for each other?" Aianu asked quietly. "Family," Walsh laughed. "Mr. McKinnon here is white, you're Apache, and the child is, well, the child is our responsibility, not yours." "I am her uncle," Aianu said, simply. "By blood?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung. Pete caught Ayanu's eye and saw the same calculation there that he was making himself. How much truth could they safely reveal without making things worse? "By choice," Aianu said finally. "By love and by choice." "That's very touching," Harrison said, "but choice doesn't give you legal standing. The child needs to be placed in an appropriate environment where she can learn proper American values and behaviors." "She knows proper values," Keya interjected indignantly. "Grandfather Pete taught me to be honest and kind and brave. Uncle Aianu taught me to respect all living things and to be proud of who I am. What other values do I need?" The agents exchanged another look at this articulate response from someone they had probably expected to find living like a savage in the wilderness. "The child seems well-spoken," Walsh admitted grudgingly, "but that doesn't address the larger concerns about her situation." Outside, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. Through the window, Pete could see Morrison arriving with a small entourage that included what looked like a lawyer and several townspeople. The carnival owner had clearly decided to press his own claims while the government agents were present. "Ah," Harrison said with satisfaction. "Mr. Morrison, right on time." Pete's blood ran cold as he realized this visit had been coordinated, that Morrison had somehow involved the federal authorities in his dispute over Aianu's status. Morrison entered without waiting for an invitation, his lawyer close behind. "Gentlemen," he said with oily confidence, "I trust you've explained to Mr. McKinnon that he's been harboring stolen property." "Stolen property?" Pete's voice rose with outrage. "This Apache male was contracted to me for a specific period of time," Morrison explained smoothly. "When he failed to return as agreed, it constituted theft of services. I'm prepared to be generous and accept financial compensation, but the contract must be honored." Aianu stepped forward, his face hard with controlled anger. "I am not property to be bought and sold. According to the law, you are what your situation makes you," Morrison's lawyer interjected. "You have no legal standing as an individual, no rights that supersede legitimate business contracts." "This is insane," Pete said, looking to Sheriff Bradley for support. "You can't seriously be considering treating human beings like livestock." Bradley looked uncomfortable, but didn't intervene. This was clearly beyond his jurisdiction and his comfort level. Agent Harrison consulted his notebook again. "The situation is complicated by the child's presence," he said. "Our primary concern is her welfare and proper development. If Mr. Morrison is willing to include her in his traveling exhibition as an authentic Apache family unit, it might actually serve educational purposes." The words hit Pete like a physical blow. They were talking about turning Keya into a carnival attraction, displaying her like some kind of exotic specimen for the entertainment of crowds. No, he said firmly. Absolutely not. I'm afraid you don't have much choice in the matter, Harrison replied. Unless you can prove you're her legal guardian through proper channels, the Bureau has authority to place her where we see fit. Keya had been listening to this exchange with growing distress, her young mind struggling to understand why these strangers wanted to take her away from the only family she had ever known. I don't want to go with them, she said in a small voice. I want to stay here with Grandfather Pete and Uncle Aianu. Children don't always know what's best for them, Walsh said dismissively. Aianu knelt down beside Keya, placing gentle hands on her shoulders. From his pocket, he drew out something that Pete had never seen before. An eagle feather, beautifully preserved and decorated with small beads and strips of colored leather. This belonged to my grandmother, he said softly in Apache, then repeated it in English for the benefit of their audience. She gave it to me when I became a man and told me to pass it on when I found someone worthy of carrying our family's honor. He placed the feather in Keya's small hands with ceremonial solemnity. You are Keya, granddaughter of warriors, keeper of ancient wisdom, bridge between two worlds. No matter what happens, remember who you are. The simple ceremony seemed to transform the atmosphere in the room. Even the government agents appeared momentarily moved by the dignity and genuine love displayed between uncle and niece. But Harrison quickly recovered his official demeanor. Very touching, he said, but we have a job to do here. Mr. McKinnon, you have 24 hours to produce legal documentation proving your guardianship of this child, or we'll be forced to remove her to a more appropriate environment. As the agents and Morrison's party prepared to leave, Agent Walsh paused at the door. For what it's worth, he said quietly to Pete, the child does seem well cared for, but the law is the law, and we have our orders. After they were gone, the three family members sat in stunned silence, each grappling with the magnitude of what they faced. Tomorrow, everything they had built together might be torn apart by forces beyond their control, but tonight they still had each other, and they would use every hour to find a way to stay together. The territorial courthouse in Cedar Ridge had never seen anything quite like the hearing that convened at 10 o'clock the following morning. Judge William Crenshaw, a man in his 60s with the weathered look of someone who had spent decades trying to apply Eastern laws to Western realities, surveyed the packed courtroom with obvious unease. At the plaintiff's table sat Morrison and his lawyer, confident in their legal position and the government backing they had secured. Agent Harrison represented the Bureau of Indian Affairs, his briefcase filled with regulations and precedents that supported federal authority over Apache affairs. At the defendant's table, Pete sat with Aianu and Keya, feeling desperately outmatched. Despite the presence of Samuel Hartwell, the only lawyer in town willing to take their case. Hartwell was young and inexperienced, more accustomed to handling property disputes and minor criminal matters than constitutional questions about human rights and family law. Your Honor, Harrison began when called upon to present the government's position. This case involves the illegal harboring of government wards and the improper placement of an Apache child outside approved institutional care. The defendants have no legal standing to maintain custody of the minor in question. Judge Crenshaw adjusted his spectacles and studied the documents before him. And the child's current living conditions? While adequate on the surface, they expose her to inappropriate cultural influences that impede proper assimilation into American society. The presence of an Apache male as a role model is particularly concerning. Morrison's lawyer stood next. Furthermore, Your Honor, my client has valid contractual claims against the Apache male in question. He was purchased for a specified period of service and failed to complete his obligations. Purchased. Judge Crenshaw's eyebrows rose. Are we talking about slavery here, Counselor? Not slavery, Your Honor. Legitimate labor contracts with individuals who have no legal standing to negotiate on their own behalf. Pete watched this exchange with growing horror. They were discussing Aianu as if he were livestock, debating Keya's future as if she were a commodity to be distributed according to bureaucratic convenience. When called upon to respond, Samuel Hartwell did his best with the limited resources at his disposal. Your Honor, Mr. McKinnon has provided excellent care for this child for over 5 years. She is healthy, educated, and happy. To remove her now would be traumatic and unnecessary. Can Mr. McKinnon prove legal guardianship? The judge asked. Hartwell hesitated. This was the weakest part of their case. The circumstances of the child's placement were informal, Your Honor. Her dying mother entrusted her to Mr. McKinnon's care, but there was no formal legal process. Then the Bureau's authority is clear, Harrison interjected. Apache children must be placed through proper channels. Judge Crenshaw looked down at Keya, who sat between Pete and Aianu with the eagle feather clutched tightly in her small hands. Young lady, he said gently, do you understand what we're talking about here? Keya stood up with the poise of someone far older than her 7 years. Yes, sir. These men want to take me away from my family and make me live with strangers. And how do you feel about that? I think it's wrong, she said clearly. Grandfather Pete loves me and takes good care of me. Uncle Aianu teaches me important things about my heritage. Why would anyone want to break up a family that works perfectly? Well, the simple eloquence of her response created a murmur of sympathy from the spectators. Judge Crenshaw appeared genuinely moved by her dignity and articulate presentation. Mr. McKinnon, the judge said, would you like to make a statement? Pete stood slowly, his hands trembling with the weight of what he was about to reveal. He had spent the entire night wrestling with this decision, knowing that the truth might save Keya, but could destroy his own carefully constructed life. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil, I've been less than completely honest about my relationship to this child. Harrison leaned forward with interest, sensing an advantage. Hartwell looked puzzled and concerned. Keya is not just an Apache child I took in out of charity, Pete continued. She is my blood relative. Her father was my brother. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Crenshaw banged his gavel for order. That's quite a claim, Mr. McKinnon. Do you have proof? With shaking hands, Pete withdrew the hidden documents from Desba's dress. I do, Your Honor. I recently discovered that I was born Apache myself, adopted by white parents as a toddler. Keya's father, Naiche, was your brother. That makes me her uncle by blood, not just by choice. Agent Harrison was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate fabrication designed to... The documents appear authentic, Judge Crenshaw interrupted, examining the papers Pete had submitted. Birth certificates, marriage records, tribal genealogies. If these are genuine, they completely change the legal landscape of this case. The wooden gavel in the judge's hands seemed to carry the weight of Solomon's sword as he contemplated a decision that would determine not just Keya's future, but the precedent for how such cases would be handled throughout the territory. The judge's chambers felt cramped with so many people crammed into the small space. Judge Crenshaw had called for a recess to examine the documents more carefully, and now the major players in the case sat around his desk while he studied the evidence with a magnifying glass. These appear to be genuine, he said finally, setting down the birth certificate that identified Pete as Apache-born. The paper, the ink, the official seals, if they're forgeries, they're remarkably sophisticated ones. Agent Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Even if we accept the authenticity of these documents, it doesn't necessarily change the Bureau's position. Apache children are still subject to federal oversight, regardless of family relationships. Perhaps, Judge Crenshaw replied thoughtfully, but it certainly complicates your case. You're asking me to remove a child from the care of her blood. Uncle, who happens to be a decorated war veteran and respected member of this community, to place her in the custody of strangers. Morrison's lawyer leaned forward. Your Honor, we still have the matter of the breach of contract. Regardless of family relationships, my client has legitimate business claims. Actually, came a new voice from the doorway. "I don't think he does." Everyone turned to see Sheriff Bradley entering the chambers, his face grim but determined. "Your Honor, I've been doing some investigating into Mr. Morrison's business practices. I think the court should hear what I discovered." Judge Crenshaw nodded. "Proceed, Sheriff." Bradley pulled out a worn notebook. "I sent telegrams to several towns where Morrison's carnival has operated over the past year. Turns out he's got quite a pattern of making these labor contracts with Apache men, then abandoning them in remote locations when he's done with them. 3 men have died as a result of his negligence." Morrison shot to his feet. "That's a damned lie. I've always honored my contracts." "Sit down, Mr. Morrison," the judge said sharply. "Sheriff, continue." "Furthermore," Bradley went on, "I discovered that many of the artifacts in his collection were stolen from graves and sacred sites. The territorial marshal is very interested in speaking with him about that." The revelation sent shockwaves through the small room. Harrison looked like he had just swallowed something distasteful, while Morrison's lawyer was frantically whispering in his client's ear. Judge Crenshaw studied Morrison with obvious disgust. "Is this true? Have you been grave robbing?" "I resent the implication," Morrison blustered. "Everything in my collection was legally acquired, from dead people who couldn't object," Aianu said quietly, speaking for the first time since entering. "The chambers, from sacred places that should never have been disturbed." The judge turned his attention to Aianu. "You've been remarkably silent through all of this. What is your position?" Aianu straightened in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "Your Honor, I claim no legal rights that the white man's law would recognize. But I claim the right that any man has to protect his family. Keya is my brother's daughter. Pete is my brother by blood and by choice. We are family, and family does not abandon each other. But you would be willing to relinquish any custody claims if it were in the child's best interest." The question hung in the air like a sword over Ayanu's head. Everyone in the room understood what the judge was really asking. Would he sacrifice his own happiness for Keya's welfare? "If I truly believed it was best for her, yes," Aianu said simply, "but I do not believe that. She belongs with us." Judge Crenshaw opened a different folder and withdrew a sheet of paper that had been handed to him just before the recess. "This is interesting. It's a hand-drawn picture that was found in the child's belongings." He held up Keya's artwork, a child's crayon drawing that showed 3 figures standing in front of a small house. A tall man, a shorter, older man, and a little girl between them, all holding hands under a bright yellow sun. "She drew this yesterday evening," Pete said softly, "after the agents left. What did she tell you about it?" "She said it was her family," Pete replied. "All of her family, together where they belong." The judge studied the simple drawing with the kind of attention usually reserved for legal briefs. "In my 30 years on the bench," he said finally, "I've seen a lot of custody cases. I've had to make decisions about placing children in situations that the law considered appropriate, but common sense questioned." He set the drawing down carefully. "This child is clearly loved, well cared for and happy. She's living with her blood relatives in a stable home environment. The only legal impediment I can see is bureaucratic procedure, which I'm frankly inclined to dismiss." Agent Harrison made one last attempt. "Your Honor, there are federal guidelines which I'm empowered to interpret based on the best interests of the child," the judge interrupted, "and in this case those interests seem clear." Morrison's lawyer tried a different approach. "What about the contract dispute? Given Sheriff Bradley's revelations about your client's business practices, I'd suggest you focus on preparing a defense against the criminal charges he'll likely be facing," Judge Crenshaw replied dryly. The judge stood, signaling that the private conference was over. "Gentleman, lady, we're going back into court. I'm ready to render my decision." As they filed back into the courtroom, Pete felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Despite the judge's apparent sympathy, he knew that legal decisions could be unpredictable, especially when federal authority was involved. Keya sat in the front row of the gallery, the eagle feather still clutched in her small hands. When she saw them returning, she smiled with the kind of trust that only children could maintain in the face of adult uncertainties. Judge Crenshaw took his place behind the bench and called the court to order. The wooden gavel in his hand seemed to carry the weight of 3 lives as he prepared to deliver a judgment that would either preserve their family or scatter them to the winds. 1 year later, the photographer from the territorial newspaper positioned his large camera carefully on its tripod, adjusting the lens to capture the family portrait that would accompany his story about unusual legal precedents in frontier and custody cases. Pete stood behind the chair where Keya sat, his weathered hands resting gently on her shoulders. Aianu stood beside them, tall and dignified in his best shirt, a slight smile softening his usually serious expression. "Hold very still now," the photographer instructed. "This will take several seconds." As the camera captured their image, Pete reflected on how much had changed since that fateful day when a 7-year-old girl had pointed at a Apache warrior and declared, "I'll take the giant one." The words that had seemed like childish whim had somehow set in motion a series of events that had transformed all their lives. Judge Crenshaw's decision had been both simple and revolutionary. He ruled that the child's best interests were clearly served by remaining with her blood relatives, and that federal bureaucracy could not supersede family bonds when those bonds were genuine and beneficial. More importantly, he had set a legal precedent that recognized the rights of Native Americans to maintain family structures outside the reservation system. Morrison had left town the day after the hearing, 1 step ahead of federal marshals investigating his grave-robbing activities. The Apache artifacts he had stolen were returned to the tribes they belonged to, though the sacred prayer beads that had started everything now hung in a place of honor in Pete's home. A gift from the tribal council in recognition of his protection, of their heritage, all finished, the photographer announced, beginning to pack up his equipment. That should make a fine picture for the story. After he left, the 3 of them sat on the front porch enjoying the late afternoon sun. Keya was practicing her letters, writing carefully in both English and Apache script in a journal that Aianu had made for her. Her education had become a blend of traditional schooling and cultural instruction, preparing her to navigate both worlds with equal confidence. "Grandfather Pete," she said, looking up from her writing. "Mrs. Henderson in town asked me yesterday if I missed not having a normal family." Pete winced slightly. Even a year later, some members of the community still struggled to accept their unconventional household. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I wouldn't know what normal was because this is the only family I've ever really known," Keya replied matter-of-factly. "Then I asked her what was so special about normal anyway." Aianu chuckled, a sound that had become much more common over the past year. "And what did she say to that?" "She got that look grown-ups get when they can't think of a good answer," Keya said with satisfaction. Then she changed the subject to something about the weather. The front gate squeaked, announcing the arrival of their neighbor, Sarah Chen, whose family had recently moved to Cedar Ridge from San Francisco. She carried a covered dish and wore the kind of smile that suggested a social call rather than business. "Evening, folks," Sarah called out. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just enjoying the sunset," Pete replied, standing to greet. What brings you by?" "Brought you some of my mother's dumplings," Sarah said, offering the dish. "And I wanted to ask if you'd heard about the new family moving into the old Jacobson place." "Can't say that we have," Pete said, accepting the food gratefully. "Chinese family," Sarah continued, "name of Wong. They've got 3 children, and they're looking to start a small farm. Some folks in town are making noises about too many foreigners settling in the area." Pete and Aianu exchanged glances. They had both experienced enough prejudice to recognize the pattern Sarah was describing. "Anything we can do to help?" Aianu asked. "Well," Sarah said with a meaningful look, "I was thinking that if the Wong family met some of the more respected members of the community, people who had overcome their own challenges with acceptance, it might help smooth their transition." Keya looked up from her journal with interest. "Are there children my age?" "2 girls, 8 and 10 years old," Sarah confirmed. "I imagine they'd appreciate having a friend who understands what it's like to be different in a small town." "We'd be happy to meet them," Pete said firmly. "Maybe invite them over for Sunday dinner this week." After Sarah left, the 3 of them continued their quiet evening routine. Aianu worked on a new dream catcher, his large fingers surprisingly deft with the delicate sinew and beads. Pete whittled a small horse from a piece of cedar, adding to the collection of wooden animals that had become Keya's treasured toys. Keya alternated between practicing her writing and asking questions about everything from why the stars moved across the sky to whether horses dreamed. As darkness fell and the oil lamps were lit, Pete found himself marveling at how ordinary their extraordinary life had become. The legal battles were behind them, the community had largely accepted their presence, and they had settled into the comfortable rhythms of a family that worked. "Uncle Aianu," Keya said as they prepared for bed, "do you ever miss your old life? Before you came to live with us?" Aianu considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked him something important. "I miss the people I lost," he said finally. "I will always carry sadness for my wife and daughter, for all the family members who are gone. But I do not miss the loneliness or the anger that filled my days before I found you and grandfather." "Pete," Keya continued, "do you ever wish you had adopted a normal white granddaughter instead of me?" Pete knelt down beside her bed, taking her small hands in his weathered ones. "Keya McKinnon," he said seriously, "you are exactly the granddaughter I was meant to have. Not because of your blood or your heritage, but because of who you are. Brave and kind and wise beyond your years." She smiled and settled back against her pillow, the eagle feather from Aianu placed carefully on her bedside table next to the faded photograph of her mother. "I love you both," she said sleepily, "my whole family." As Pete tucked the blankets around her and Aianu sang a soft Apache lullaby, the little girl who had once stood in front of a carnival platform and chosen love over fear drifted off to sleep, dreaming of tomorrow's adventures and the family that would face them together. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, indifferent to the human dramas playing out below. But in one small house in Cedar Ridge, 3 souls who had found each other against all odds settled into peaceful rest. Proof that sometimes the most broken people make the strongest families, and that love truly can bridge any divide.